the shovel hit something solid. Dr. James Anderson stopped mid-swing, his breath catching in the humid Illinois air. It was June 1963, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cornfield outside Collinsville. The smell of freshly turned earth mixed with something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting beneath this ground for centuries. He dropped to his knees and began brushing away the dirt with his hands. His fingers traced the edge of what he thought might be stone, but it was not stone. It was compacted earth, layered and deliberate, shaped by human hands. Anderson's heart pounded as he realized what he was touching. This was not supposed to be here. For weeks, his team had been excavating what they believed were simple burial mounds, remnants of some forgotten Native American settlement. Small-scale stuff, unimpressive, the kind of dig that barely made local newspapers. But as they cleared away more soil, as they mapped and measured and photographed, a different picture began to emerge. The mounds were not random. They were organized, planned, massive, and beneath them, spreading out in every direction like the bones of some enormous creature, was evidence of something that shook Anderson to his core. A city, not a village, not a temporary camp, a city that rivaled anything in medieval Europe, a city built by people who, according to every history book in America, were not supposed to have the knowledge, the organization, or the numbers to build anything like this. Hey there, this is Mr. H, and welcome back to the channel. If you are into mysteries that challenge everything you thought you knew about history, you are in the right place. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what we are about to uncover tonight will completely change how you see ancient America. But back to that summer day in 1963, when everything changed, because what Anderson found beneath that Illinois cornfield was impossible, and yet it was real. The name Cahokia came later, borrowed from a tribe that lived in the area centuries after the original builders had vanished. We do not know what the people who built this place called it. We do not know what they called themselves. That knowledge died with them, lost to time and silence. But what we do know is staggering. At its peak, around the year 1050 to 1200, Cahokia was home to somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 people. Let that sink in for a moment. 20 to 40,000 people living in one place, in pre-Columbian North America, in what is now southern Illinois. To put that in perspective, London in the year 1100 had a population of roughly 15 to 20,000. Paris was about the same size. Cahokia was larger than both of them. It was the biggest city north of Mexico, and it would remain the biggest city in what would become the United States until Philadelphia surpassed it in the 1700s. 700 years later, this was not some primitive settlement of scattered huts and campfires. This was an urban center, a sprawling metropolis that covered nearly 6 square miles. The central city alone contained over 120 earthen mounds, each one serving a specific purpose: ceremonial platforms, elite residences, burial sites, foundations for wooden temples that once stood stories high, and towering above them all was Monk's Mound. Monk's Mound is the largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas. It rises 100 feet into the air across 4 massive terraces. Its base covers 14 acres. That is more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The pyramid might be taller, but in terms of sheer base area, Monk's Mound is bigger. Think about that for a second. The Great Pyramid was built with stone blocks, pulleys, ramps, and the organized labor of ancient Egypt's entire state apparatus. Monk's Mound was built with baskets of dirt, carried by hand. Somewhere around 22 million cubic feet of earth was moved, one basket at a time, to create this monument. No wheels, no horses, no metal tools, just human labor, human planning, and human determination. The mound itself was not just a pile of dirt, it was engineered. Archaeologists have discovered that the builders used different types of soil in specific layers to prevent collapse and manage water drainage. They understood load-bearing capacity. They understood erosion. The terraces were deliberately designed, each one flat and stable, meant to support buildings that no longer exist. On top of Monk's Mound stood the largest structure in the city, likely the residence of Cahokia's paramount chief or high priest. From that height, the ruler could look out over the entire city, over the massive plazas below, over the thousands of homes stretching to the horizon. It was a statement of power, of control, of divine authority. But Monk's Mound was just one piece of the puzzle. Surrounding the central city was a sprawling urban landscape of homes, workshops, plazas, and neighborhoods. Archaeologists estimate that at its height, The Greater Cahokia region may have had a population density comparable to modern suburban areas. People lived in rectangular houses with thatched roofs and plastered walls. They farmed the rich floodplains of the Mississippi River. They hunted, they fished, they traded, and they built something truly extraordinary. To the west of Monk's Mound, archaeologists discovered a series of wooden post circles, now known as Woodhenge. These were not decorative, they were functional. Astronomical observatories, the posts were aligned with the solstices and equinoxes, marking the changing seasons with precision. Imagine standing in the center of that circle on the morning of the winter solstice, watching the sun rise directly over a specific post, knowing that your ancestors had stood in that exact spot for generations, watching the same sunrise, marking the same sacred moment. This was not primitive superstition. This was science, observation, mathematics, a sophisticated understanding of the cosmos. Cahokia also had a grand plaza, a flat open space covering roughly 50 acres. 50 acres of carefully maintained, level ground. No buildings, no mounds. Just open space for gatherings, for ceremonies, for the rituals that held this society together. Tens of thousands of people could assemble there at once, and surrounding the entire central complex was a palisade wall, a massive wooden fortification that was rebuilt multiple times over the centuries. The wall had guard towers and gates. It was defensive, yes, but it was also symbolic. It marked the boundary between the sacred center and the world beyond. But here is what they do not tell you in textbooks. Cahokia was not some isolated anomaly. It was the center of a vast trade network that stretched across the continent. Archaeologists have found copper from the Great Lakes region, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, shells from the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic coast. These were not items that drifted into Cahokia by accident. They were imported, traded, desired. Mica, for example, has no practical use. It does not make better tools. It does not improve food storage. But it is beautiful. It shimmers. It reflects light. And Cahokia's elite wanted it. They wanted it so badly that they organized trade expeditions across hundreds of miles to bring it back. That tells us something profound. This was a society with surplus, with wealth, with a class of people who had time and resources to think about beauty, about status, about things beyond mere survival. And that raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If Cahokia was this advanced, this organized, this sophisticated, why do most Americans have no idea it ever existed? The copper workshops were the first clue that something did not add up. In the early 2000s, archaeologists uncovered evidence of large-scale copper production at Cahokia, not just small-scale crafting. Industrial-level metallurgy, they found tools, debris, and the remnants of workshops where artisans hammered raw copper into sheets, earrings, ceremonial plates, and ritual objects. The copper itself came from the Great Lakes region, over 500 miles away. Somebody had to travel there, mine it, transport it back, and then process it. That requires organization, supply chains, specialists who knew how to work metal, and most importantly, it requires a society stable and wealthy enough to support those specialists. Because here is the thing about metallurgy. You cannot just pick up a piece of copper and start hammering. Work hardens. It becomes brittle. You have to anneal it, heating it to specific temperatures, and then cooling it in controlled ways to restore its malleability. The people at Cahokia understood this. They had mastered it. And they were doing this centuries before Europeans arrived in the Americas. But copper was just the beginning. Archaeologists also found marine shells, thousands of them. Conch shells from the Gulf of Mexico, whelk shells from the Atlantic coast. Some were carved into intricate designs, faces, animals, geometric patterns. Others were fashioned into beads, gorgets, and pendants. These shells traveled over 1,000 miles to reach Cahokia. Why? They had no practical function. You cannot eat them. You cannot build with them. But they were valuable, intensely valuable. They were status symbols, markers of power and prestige. The elite of Cahokia wore these shells the way European nobility wore gold and jewels. And then there is the mica. Mica is a mineral that splits into thin, translucent sheets. It sparkles, it catches light, and it is completely useless for anything practical. You cannot make tools from it. You cannot use it for building. But Cahokia imported tons of it from the Appalachian Mountains, over 600 miles to the east. Archaeologists have found enormous sheets of mica buried in mounds, carefully shaped into ceremonial objects. One excavation uncovered a mica sheet cut into the shape of a human hand. Another revealed a mica effigy of a bird. These were not accidents. They were deliberate works of art, painstakingly crafted by skilled artisans. But why import something so fragile and difficult to transport across such vast distances? Why dedicate so much labor and resources to something with no practical value? The answer is simple. Because they could. Cahokia had the surplus, the organization, and the power to acquire luxury goods from across the continent. They had the wealth to support a class of artisans whose only job was to create beautiful, sacred, ceremonial objects. This was not a society barely scraping by. This was a society thriving, and the evidence keeps piling up. Archaeologists have found shell-tempered pottery at Cahokia, a distinctive style that spread throughout the Mississippi River Valley. The presence of this pottery at other sites hundreds of miles away tells us that Cahokia was not just importing goods, it was exporting culture. Its influence radiated outward, shaping the beliefs, the art, and the social structures of neighboring communities. There is also evidence of specialized labor. Excavations have revealed distinct neighborhoods where specific crafts were practiced. One area was dedicated to bead making, another to stone tool production, another to pottery. This was not a subsistence economy where everyone did a little bit of everything. This was a complex urban society with occupational specialization, just like the cities of ancient Mesopotamia or medieval Europe. And then there is the urban planning. Cahokia was not thrown together haphazardly. It was designed. The mounds are arranged in deliberate patterns, aligned with cardinal directions and astronomical events. The Grand Plaza is perfectly level, graded, and maintained over centuries. The neighborhoods are organized into districts. The elite lived on or near the mounds. The commoners lived in the surrounding areas. There was order, structure, hierarchy. But perhaps the most controversial evidence comes from Mound 72. In 1967, archaeologist Melvin Fowler excavated this mound and found something disturbing. Beneath the earth were the remains of over 270 people. Most were young women, buried in mass graves. Many showed signs of ritual sacrifice. Their bodies were arranged in specific patterns, suggesting that their deaths were part of a ceremonial event. One burial was particularly striking. A man, likely a high-status individual, was laid to rest on a platform made of 20,000 shell beads. Surrounding him were the bodies of 53 young women, all killed and buried at the same time. Nearby were 4 men with their heads and hands removed, and 3 men and 3 women who appeared to have been buried alive. This is the part of Cahokia's story that makes people uncomfortable, because it suggests that this was not some egalitarian paradise. This was a society with immense social inequality, with rulers who wielded absolute power over life and death. The evidence points to human sacrifice on a scale that rivals the Aztecs or the ancient Maya. But even this tells us something important. Societies do not develop that level of control, that level of ritual complexity, without being highly organized, without having institutions, hierarchies, and belief systems that bind people together. Cahokia was not a loose collection of tribes. It was a state, a government, a civilization. And that is the word that changes everything. Civilization. Because that word has been reserved, historically, for societies in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, India, Greece, and Rome. Not for Native Americans, not for the people who built Cahokia. The narrative we have been taught, the story that has been passed down through textbooks and documentaries for generations, is that pre-Columbian North America was sparsely populated, undeveloped, primitive, but the evidence at Cahokia tells a different story. A story of engineers and astronomers, of traders and artisans, of priests and rulers, of a city that should not have existed, but did. Here is where things get even more strange. Cahokia reached its peak between the years 10, 50, and 1200. That is the 11th and 12th centuries, the medieval period, the time of castles and knights, and the Crusades. While European lords were building stone fortresses and waging wars over feudal territories, the people of Cahokia were constructing earthen pyramids and mapping the stars. While London was a crowded, disease-ridden city of wooden buildings and narrow streets, Cahokia had organized urban planning and monumental architecture. But here is the problem that historians have struggled with for decades. This civilization arose with no clear predecessors. Sure, there were earlier cultures in the region, the Hopewell people, the Adena culture, other mound-building societies scattered across the Mississippi Valley. But none of them came close to the scale and sophistication of Cahokia. It was like Cahokia exploded onto the scene, fully formed, around the year 900 or so. Within 150 years, It had become the largest city in North America. And then, just as suddenly, it collapsed. By the year 1350, Cahokia was abandoned, empty. The population had dispersed. The great plazas fell silent. The temples on top of the mounds rotted away. Within a few generations, the memory of what Cahokia had been started to fade. When European explorers arrived in the 1600s, they found scattered tribes living in the area, but no great city, no massive earthworks being maintained. The mounds were still there, of course, overgrown with grass and trees, but the people who encountered them had no knowledge of who built them or why. And this is where the narrative gets complicated, because the Europeans who colonized North America needed to believe a specific story. They needed to believe that this land was empty, that it was wilderness, that the people living here were primitive and uncivilized. That belief justified everything that came after: the displacement, the violence, the erasure. So when French missionaries arrived in the area in the late 1600s and saw Monk's Mound, they did not attribute it to the Native Americans. They could not. It did not fit the narrative. Some speculated it was built by a lost tribe of Israel. Others thought it might be the work of ancient Phoenicians or Vikings, or some other group of white people who had mysteriously vanished. The idea that indigenous Americans could have built something so impressive was, to them, impossible. Even when American settlers moved into the area in the 1800s, they saw the mounds as curiosities, as relics of some mysterious vanished race. They called them the Mound Builders, as if they were a separate people entirely, unconnected to the Native Americans who still lived in the region. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that archaeologists began to seriously consider the possibility that Native Americans had built Cahokia. And even then, it took decades for that idea to gain acceptance. Think about that timeline for a second. Cahokia was abandoned around 1350. By the time Europeans arrived, just 250 years later, the city was already a mystery. The knowledge of who built it, how they organized themselves, what language they spoke, what they believed, all of that was gone. 250 years might sound like a long time, but it is not. That is the same amount of time between now and the year 1775. Imagine if all knowledge of the American Revolution, the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, everything, was completely erased. No written records, no oral traditions, nothing. That is what happened to Cahokia. And it raises an unsettling question. If a civilization this advanced, this organized, this powerful, could vanish so completely in just a few centuries, what else have we forgotten? What other cities, what other cultures, what other achievements have been lost to time? Before we dive deeper into that mystery, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Are you listening at home, on a late-night drive, or maybe trying to fall asleep? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you all, and it helps me understand who is on this journey with us. Because what we are about to explore next gets even stranger. We are going to talk about the engineering that should not have been possible, the astronomical knowledge that rivals ancient observatories on the other side of the world, and the society that built it all. A society that, according to every history book you have ever read, should not have existed. Let us talk about the engineering, because when you really start to break down what the people of Cahokia accomplished, the sheer scale of it becomes almost incomprehensible. Monk's Mound, as we mentioned, contains roughly 22 million cubic feet of earth. But that number is so large, it almost loses meaning. So let us put it in terms that make more sense. If you were to move that amount of earth using modern dump trucks, you would need around 50,000 truckloads. 50,000. And that is just for one mound. Remember, there are over 120 mounds at Cahokia. Now, imagine doing all of that without trucks, without wheelbarrows, without metal tools. Every single cubic foot of earth was carried in baskets, woven baskets that held maybe 50 or 60 pounds of dirt at a time. Workers would fill these baskets at borrow pits, areas where they dug up soil, and then carry them to the construction site. Up ramps, up slopes, up the growing terraces of the mound itself. How many trips would that take? How many people? How many years? Archaeologists estimate it would have required the labor of thousands of workers over several decades. And this was not random piling. This was precise, engineered construction. The builders used different types of soil for different purposes. They layered clay-rich soil in certain areas to create barriers against water infiltration. They used sandy, well-draining soil in other areas to prevent the mound from becoming waterlogged and unstable. They understood soil mechanics in ways that would not be formally studied in Europe until centuries later. And the terraces themselves were not accidental. Each one was carefully designed to be flat and stable. Archaeologists have found post holes on these terraces, evidence of large wooden structures that once stood on top of them, buildings that were substantial enough to require deep foundation posts. The engineering extended beyond just the mounds. Cahokia had sophisticated drainage systems. The city sat on the Mississippi River floodplain, an area prone to flooding and waterlogging. But the builders understood hydrology. They graded the land to direct water away from key areas. They built channels and ditches to manage runoff. They elevated important structures on platforms to keep them above potential floodwaters. This was urban planning. Real urban planning. The kind you see in ancient Rome or Han Dynasty China. And then there is the Palisade Wall. This wall surrounded the central core of Cahokia, enclosing roughly 200 acres. It was built from massive wooden logs, each one set deep into the ground and standing 15 to 20 feet tall. The logs were placed side by side, creating a solid barrier with bastions, watchtowers, and gates at strategic points. But here is what makes it even more impressive. The wall was rebuilt at least 4 times over the course of Cahokia's history. Each time, the old logs were removed and new ones were set in place. That means the builders had to harvest thousands of trees, transport them to the site, dig new post holes, and erect the wall all over again. Why? Wooden structures decay, especially in a humid, flood-prone environment. The wall needed constant maintenance and eventual replacement, and the fact that they rebuilt it multiple times tells us that they considered it essential, whether for defense, for ceremonial purposes, or simply as a symbol of the city's power. The wall mattered, but perhaps the most impressive feat of engineering at Cahokia is not a single structure. It is the coordination required to make all of this happen. Building a city like Cahokia required planning. You need architects who can design the mounds. You need laborers who can move the earth. You need overseers who can organize thousands of workers. You need a system to feed all those people while they are working instead of farming. You need a government strong enough to command that kind of labor, whether through taxation, tribute, or religious authority. And you need a reason, a belief system powerful enough to convince people that building these monuments is worth the effort. Because here is the thing. Monk's Mound did not house anyone. It did not store grain. It did not serve a practical function in the way a granary or a fortress would. It was symbolic. It was a statement. It said, "We are powerful. We are organized. We can move mountains." And they did. But the engineering alone does not explain Cahokia. Because what really sets this civilization apart is not just what they built, but why they built it. And to understand that, we need to look up to the stars. The people of Cahokia were obsessed with the sky. And when I say obsessed, I mean they organized their entire city around celestial events. The layout of the mounds, the orientation of the plazas, the placement of ceremonial structures, all of it was aligned with the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars. This was not coincidence. This was deliberate, intentional, sacred. The most striking evidence of this astronomical knowledge is Woodhenge. Woodhenge was a series of large wooden post circles located just west of Monk's Mound. Archaeologists have identified at least 5 different versions of these circles, rebuilt and expanded over time. The largest one contained 48 posts arranged in a perfect circle, each post standing about 20 feet tall and spaced evenly around a diameter of 410 feet. At the center of the circle was a single observation post. If you stood at that center post during certain times of the year and looked towards specific posts on the perimeter, you could track the rising sun on the solstices and equinoxes, the summer solstice, the winter solstice, the spring and fall equinoxes, each one marked by a different post. This was an astronomical observatory, an ancient calendar built from wood and earth, and it was accurate, remarkably accurate. The alignments at Woodhenge match up with modern astronomical calculations. The builders of Cahokia knew exactly when the longest day of the year would occur. They knew when the seasons would change. They could predict these events with precision, year after year, generation after generation. But why did they care so much? For agricultural societies, tracking the seasons is essential. Knowing when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare for winter, that knowledge means survival. But Cahokia's astronomical sophistication went far beyond simple farming calendars. The alignment suggests something deeper, something religious, something cosmological. Many indigenous cultures across the Americas believed that the movements of celestial bodies were connected to the divine. The sun was not just a source of light and warmth, it was a god, a life-giver. The solstices and equinoxes were not just seasonal markers, they were sacred moments when the boundary between the earthly and the spiritual became thin. At Cahokia, these moments were celebrated with grand ceremonies. Imagine standing in the Grand Plaza on the morning of the winter solstice. Thousands of people gathered in the cold pre-dawn darkness, priests and elites stationed on top of Monk's Mound, everyone waiting, watching. And then, as the sun rises, it aligns perfectly with one of the posts at Woodhenge, a beam of light cutting through the morning mist, a sign from the gods that the world will continue, that the sun will return, that life will go on. That moment, that alignment, reinforced the power of the rulers. It proved they had special knowledge, a connection to the cosmos, the ability to predict and control the movements of the heavens. And it was not just the sun. Archaeologists have found evidence that Cahokia's builders also tracked lunar cycles, the moon's phases, its rising and setting points, the timing of eclipses. Some researchers believe that certain mounds were aligned with the moon's maximum and minimum rising positions, events that occur on an 18.6-year cycle. That level of observation requires decades of careful study. It means that generations of astronomers were watching the sky, recording what they saw, passing that knowledge down to their successors. This was not casual stargazing. This was science, and it rivals what was happening in other parts of the world. The ancient Maya, for example, are famous for their astronomical knowledge, their calendar system, their ability to predict eclipses, their understanding of Venus's cycles. But Cahokia's Woodhenge shows that similar sophistication existed in North America, built by people who had no contact with Mesoamerica. The same is true of Stonehenge in England, built thousands of years earlier, but serving a similar purpose. A stone circle, aligned with the solstices. A place where people gathered to mark the changing seasons and connect with the divine. But here is what makes Cahokia's astronomical achievements even more remarkable. They did all of this without writing. The Maya had a written script. They recorded their observations in codices and carved them into stone monuments. We can read their astronomical tables today. We know what they knew because they left written records. Cahokia left none. Everything we know about their astronomical knowledge comes from the physical alignments of the structures they built. The posts, the mounds, the plazas. The architecture itself is the record. And that means the knowledge had to be passed down orally, through stories, through rituals, through teachings, from one generation to the next. How do you maintain that level of precision without writing? How do you ensure that the knowledge does not get lost or corrupted over centuries? The answer is ritual, repetition, ceremony. The annual solstice gatherings at Woodhenge were not just religious events. They were teaching moments, opportunities to pass down knowledge, to reinforce the importance of the alignments, to train the next generation of observers. And it worked. For centuries, it worked. But then, something happened. The rituals stopped. The ceremonies ended. The posts at Woodhenge rotted away and were never replaced. And the knowledge, that carefully preserved astronomical wisdom, began to fade. Which brings us to the question that haunts every archaeologist who studies Cahokia. If this society was so advanced, so organized, so deeply connected to the cosmos, why did it collapse? What could bring down a civilization this powerful? We will explore that mystery soon. But first, we need to understand the society itself, the people who lived in Cahokia, how they organized themselves, the hierarchies, the rituals, the power structures that held it all together. Because the collapse of Cahokia was not just the fall of a city, it was the end of a world. Cahokia was not a democracy. Let us be very clear about that from the start. This was a highly stratified society with rigid social hierarchies. At the top were the elites, the rulers, the priests. At the bottom were the commoners, the laborers, the farmers. And in between were artisans, traders, warriors, and administrators. Everyone had a place. Everyone knew their role. The evidence for this hierarchy is everywhere. The most obvious indicator is where people lived. The elite district was centered on and around Monk's Mound. The highest-ranking individuals lived on top of the mound itself, literally elevated above everyone else. Their homes were larger, built with better materials, positioned to overlook the entire city. From that vantage point, they could see everything. The Grand Plaza below, the neighborhood spreading out in all directions, the palisade wall marking the boundary of the sacred center. It was a physical manifestation of power. You are up here. Everyone else is down there. Archaeological excavations in elite areas have uncovered luxury goods, shell beads, copper ornaments, mica sheets, exotic materials imported from hundreds or thousands of miles away. These were status symbols, markers of wealth and prestige. The common people did not have access to these items. Only the elite did. But the hierarchy went deeper than just material wealth. Burial practices tell us a lot about social structure. When archaeologists excavate commoner burials, they find simple graves, a body placed in the ground with minimal grave goods, maybe a pot, maybe a few stone tools. Nothing elaborate. Elite burials are completely different. We already talked about the mass burial at Mound 72, where a high-status man was laid to rest on a bed of 20,000 shell beads, surrounded by the bodies of dozens of sacrificed individuals. That burial alone tells us that the rulers of Cahokia had life and death power over their subjects. But there are other elite burials that reveal just as much. Some graves contain multiple individuals buried together, all adorned with elaborate jewelry and ceremonial objects. Others have been found with caches of arrow points, hundreds of them, all perfectly crafted and never used. These were not practical items. They were offerings, symbols of the deceased's status and power. And then there is the evidence of craft specialization. In ancient societies, when you see neighborhoods dedicated to specific crafts, it tells you that the economy has moved beyond subsistence. People are not just making what they need to survive. They are producing goods for trade, for tribute, for the elite. At Cahokia, archaeologists have identified areas where beads were manufactured. Other areas specialized in stone tool production. Still others focused on pottery. Each neighborhood had its own identity, its own role in the larger economy. This kind of specialization requires a system of redistribution. The bead makers were not growing their own food. The farmers were not making their own tools. Somebody had to organize the collection of surplus food from the farms and distribute it to the artisans. Somebody had to manage trade networks and ensure that raw materials reached the workshops. That somebody was the elite. The rulers of Cahokia controlled the flow of goods and resources. They decided who got what. They collected tribute from surrounding communities. They organized labor for public works projects. They maintained the religious calendar and conducted the ceremonies that legitimized their authority. And that authority was deeply tied to religion. We do not know the specifics of Cahokia's belief system. No written records survive. But the archaeological evidence gives us clues. The alignment of the mounds with celestial events, the massive investment in ceremonial architecture, the human sacrifices. All of this points to a society where religion and politics were inseparable. The rulers were not just political leaders. They were intermediaries between the human world and the divine. They spoke to the gods. They interpreted the movements of the stars. They performed the rituals that ensured the sun would rise, the crops would grow, the floods would recede. And as long as things went well, as long as the harvests were good and the city prospered, the people believed. They accepted the hierarchy. They performed their labor. They paid their tribute. But what happens when things stop going well? What happens when the crops fail? When the river floods at the wrong time? When disease sweeps through the population? When rival groups start attacking the outskirts of the city? In a society where the ruler's power is based on their supposed connection to the divine, failure is not just a political problem. It is a religious crisis. If the gods are angry, if the rituals are not working, if the cosmos is out of balance, then maybe the rulers have lost their mandate. Maybe they are no longer fit to lead. And when that belief starts to crack, when people start to question the system, everything can fall apart very quickly. Which brings us to the great mystery, the collapse. Because sometime around the year 1200, things started to go wrong at Cahokia. Very wrong. And within a century and a half, one of the most powerful civilizations in North America had simply vanished. What happened? What could destroy a city this strong, this organized, this advanced? The answers are disturbing, and they are still debated today. The end did not come all at once. It was gradual, slow, like watching a giant tree die from the inside out. The leaves turn brown, the branches weaken, and then one day, a strong wind comes, and the whole thing comes crashing down. That is what happened to Cahokia. Around the year 1200, at the height of its power, something changed. The population began to decline. Construction projects slowed and then stopped. The great ceremonies became less frequent, and by 1350, maybe even earlier, the city was abandoned, empty. The question that has haunted archaeologists for decades is simple. Why? What could cause a civilization this powerful, this organized, to collapse so completely? There is no single answer, no smoking gun. Instead, there are theories, multiple theories, and the truth is probably some combination of all of them. Let us start with the most obvious one: environmental collapse. Cahokia was built on the floodplains of the Mississippi River. Rich soil, abundant water, perfect for agriculture. But it was also vulnerable. The river flooded regularly, sometimes catastrophically, and the city's location, while advantageous in good times, became a liability when things went wrong. Core samples taken from the area show evidence of major flooding events during Cahokia's decline. The river would overflow its banks, inundating farmland, destroying crops, displacing populations. And unlike modern cities with levees and drainage systems, Cahokia had limited ability to protect itself. But flooding was not the only environmental problem. Deforestation. Building a city the size of Cahokia required an enormous amount of wood. The palisade wall alone needed thousands of massive logs. The homes, the temples, the ceremonial structures, all built from timber. And remember, the wall was rebuilt at least 4 times. That means they had to keep harvesting trees, over and over again. Archaeologists have found evidence that the forests around Cahokia were extensively cleared. The wood was used for construction, for fuel, for cooking fires, for heating during the cold winters. As the population grew, the demand for wood increased, and eventually the nearby forests were gone. Without trees, the soil erodes more easily. Rainfall washes away the topsoil, making it harder to grow crops. The land becomes less productive, and when you have tens of thousands of people to feed, declining agricultural yields become a crisis very quickly. There is also evidence of soil depletion. The Cahokians practiced intensive agriculture, growing corn, beans, and squash in the same fields year after year. Without modern fertilizers or crop rotation techniques, the soil eventually loses its nutrients. Yields drop, harvests shrink, and suddenly, you cannot feed everyone anymore. Some researchers believe that by the late 1200s, Cahokia had pushed its environment to the breaking point. The land could no longer support the population. People started to go hungry, and when people are hungry, societies become unstable. But environmental stress alone might not have been enough to destroy Cahokia. There is another factor: climate change. Not the kind we talk about today, but a naturally occurring shift in global climate patterns. Around the year 1200s, the world entered what is known as the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped, growing seasons shortened, winters became harsher. For a civilization dependent on agriculture, this was devastating. Imagine you are a farmer at Cahokia. For generations, your family has grown corn in the same fields. You know when to plant, you know when to harvest. The rhythms of the seasons are predictable. And then, suddenly, they are not. The frosts come earlier in the fall. The spring arrives later. Your crops do not have enough time to mature before the cold returns. Your yields drop by 20%, then 30, then 50. And it is not just you. Everyone is experiencing the same thing. The entire region is struggling. When food becomes scarce, people make hard choices. Some leave, searching for better land elsewhere. Others stay and fight over what remains. Social cohesion breaks down. The rituals that once held the community together lose their power because the gods, it seems, have abandoned them. And then there is warfare. The palisade wall around Cahokia was not decorative. It was functional, defensive. The fact that it was rebuilt multiple times suggests that the threat it protected against was real and ongoing. But who were they defending against? Possibly rival groups from neighboring regions. As Cahokia grew in power and wealth, it likely created enemies, other chiefdoms that resented Cahokia's dominance, communities that were forced to pay tribute and provide labor. When Cahokia started to weaken, when the harvests failed and the population declined, those rivals saw an opportunity. Archaeological evidence from sites around Cahokia shows increased fortification during the late 1200s and early 1300s. Villages built defensive walls, settlements relocated to more defensible positions. This suggests a period of heightened conflict and instability. Some researchers believe that Cahokia may have been attacked, possibly multiple times. The elite may have been overthrown. The social order may have collapsed in violence and chaos. But there is another possibility, one that is harder to detect archaeologically but just as devastating: disease. When you concentrate thousands of people in a small area, disease spreads quickly. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, close living quarters. All of these create ideal conditions for epidemics. We know that later Native American populations were decimated by European diseases like smallpox and measles, but indigenous diseases existed long before Europeans arrived. Tuberculosis, dysentery, respiratory infections, any one of these could have swept through Cahokia, killing hundreds or thousands. And in a society already stressed by environmental collapse, climate change, and warfare, a major epidemic could have been the final blow. But perhaps the most overlooked factor in Cahokia's collapse is social and political. The hierarchy that made Cahokia powerful also made it fragile. The entire system depended on the belief that the elite had a special connection to the divine, that they could ensure good harvests, favorable weather, protection from enemies. But when the harvests failed, when the climate turned against them, when enemies attacked and disease spread, that belief started to crumble. If the rulers cannot deliver on their promises, why should anyone follow them? Why continue to pay tribute? Why work on their construction projects? Why sacrifice for their rituals? The social contract breaks down. And once people stop believing in the system, once they stop cooperating, a complex society can collapse remarkably quickly. The labor force disperses. The trade networks fall apart. The specialists who made beads and copper ornaments have no one to trade with. The farmers stop producing surplus because there is no point. Within a generation or two, the city is empty. And that seems to be what happened at Cahokia. Not a single catastrophic event, but a cascade of interconnected failures. Environmental stress weakened the agricultural base. Climate change made things worse. Warfare and disease added to the chaos. And the political and religious system that held everything together simply could not adapt. By 1350, Cahokia was a ghost town. The great plazas were silent. The temples on Monk's Mound had rotted away. The wooden posts at Woodhenge had fallen. And the people, the thousands of people who had once called this place home, were gone, scattered to the winds. Their descendants would go on to form new communities, new societies, new ways of life. But the memory of Cahokia, the knowledge of what it had been, faded, until it was almost completely forgotten. Here is the uncomfortable truth that nobody talks about. Cahokia should be as famous as Machu Picchu. It should be in every history textbook. Every American child should learn about it in school. There should be documentaries, movies, museum exhibits. It should be a source of national pride, a testament to the ingenuity and sophistication of indigenous Americans. But it is not. Most Americans have never heard of Cahokia, and that is not an accident. The erasure of Cahokia from popular consciousness is tied directly to the colonial narrative that shaped American history, a narrative that required Native Americans to be primitive, uncivilized, and incapable of creating anything sophisticated. Because if they were primitive, if they had no cities, no governments, no advanced societies, then the land was essentially empty, wilderness, free for the taking, and that made everything that came after easier to justify. When European colonizers arrived in North America, they encountered indigenous peoples living in villages and towns. They saw farming, trade, social organization, but they did not see what they considered civilization. No stone buildings, no written language, no sprawling cities, or at least, that is what they told themselves. The mounds were still there. Monk's Mound was impossible to miss, but the Europeans who saw it could not, or would not, believe that Native Americans had built it, so they invented alternatives. Some claimed it was the work of a lost tribe of Israel. Others suggested ancient Phoenicians or Egyptians had sailed across the Atlantic and built these structures before mysteriously disappearing. There were theories about Vikings, about ancient Romans, about a vanished race of white people who had once inhabited North America. Anything but the truth. This was not just ignorance, it was willful denial, because acknowledging that Native Americans had built Cahokia would have required acknowledging that they were capable of civilization, and that would have complicated the entire colonial project. The United States government, in the 1800s, had a very specific policy toward Native Americans: removal, relocation, assimilation. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced thousands of indigenous people from their ancestral lands, marching them westward on what became known as the Trail of Tears. But how do you justify forcing people off their land? How do you rationalize that level of cruelty? You tell yourself they are not really using it, that they are nomadic, primitive, that they have no concept of property or civilization, that the land is wasted on them. And you certainly do not acknowledge that their ancestors built cities. So Cahokia was forgotten, not because it was unimportant, but because remembering it was inconvenient. Even when American archaeologists began studying the mounds in the late 1800s, their conclusions were shaped by racist assumptions. Many refused to believe that Native Americans were capable of such sophisticated construction. The mound builder myth persisted well into the 20th century. It was not until the Smithsonian Institution commissioned a comprehensive study in the 1890s that the truth finally started to emerge. A man named Cyrus Thomas led an exhaustive investigation of mound sites across the country and concluded, definitively, that Native Americans had built them. But even then, the findings did not receive widespread attention. The narrative had already been set. America's origin story did not include indigenous cities or advanced civilizations. It started with European settlers taming a wild frontier, and textbooks reflected that narrative. For most of the 20th century, if Cahokia was mentioned at all in American history classes, it was a footnote, a curiosity, nothing more. The focus was always on European exploration, colonization, and westward expansion. The indigenous peoples who had lived here for thousands of years were treated as background characters in someone else's story. It was not until the 1960s and 70s, during the civil rights movement and the rise of indigenous activism, that historians began to seriously re-examine this narrative. Archaeologists like Melvin Fowler conducted extensive excavations at Cahokia, uncovering the true scale and sophistication of the site. But the damage had already been done. Generations of Americans had grown up believing that nothing of significance existed in North America before Europeans arrived. That belief is deeply ingrained, and changing it requires more than just new archaeological discoveries. It requires a complete rethinking of how we tell the story of this continent. Compare Cahokia to other ancient sites around the world. Machu Picchu, the Incan city in Peru, receives over 1 million visitors every year. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is iconic. Everyone knows what it looks like. The pyramids of Giza, the Colosseum in Rome, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, Chichen Itza in Mexico. These are household names, symbols of human achievement. But Cahokia? It gets around 300,000 visitors per year. Most of them are locals or school groups. It is not on the international tourist circuit. It is not featured in travel documentaries. It does not have the same cultural cachet. Why? Part of it is location. Cahokia sits just outside Collinsville, Illinois, in the shadow of Street Louis. It is not remote or exotic. There is no mystique of a lost city hidden in the jungle or perched on a mountain. It is just there, in the middle of farmland and suburban sprawl. But location is not the real reason. The real reason is that Cahokia challenges a narrative that many people, consciously or unconsciously, still want to believe. The narrative of American exceptionalism, the idea that civilization came to this continent with European settlers, that everything before that was primitive and insignificant. Acknowledging Cahokia means acknowledging that indigenous Americans built something extraordinary, that they had science, engineering, astronomy, government, art, religion, and culture every bit as sophisticated as anything in medieval Europe. And if we acknowledge that, we have to reckon with what was lost. Because Cahokia did not just collapse on its own. Its descendants, the people who carried forward the knowledge and traditions of the Mississippian culture, were still here when Europeans arrived, and they were decimated. Disease killed 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas within a century of contact. 90%. Entire nations, languages, cultures, knowledge systems, gone. And the survivors were displaced, killed, or forcibly assimilated. Imagine if someone had written down the history of Cahokia. Imagine if there were books, records, oral traditions that survived intact. Imagine what we could know, but there are not, because the people who remembered were mostly wiped out, and the colonizers who replaced them were not interested in preserving that history. So we are left with the mounds, silent monuments to a civilization that should not have been forgotten but was. And slowly, very slowly, we are starting to remember. In 2024, Cahokia Mounds was nominated for UNESCO World Heritage status. If accepted, it would join the ranks of the world's most important archaeological sites. It would receive international recognition, funding for preservation and research, a place in the global conversation about human history. But even that feels like too little, too late. Because for every person who knows about Cahokia, there are 100 who do not. For every student who learns about Monk's Mound in school, there are 1,000 who graduate thinking that Native American history began with European contact. The forgetting of Cahokia was not an accident. It was a choice. a choice made by generations of historians, educators, and politicians who found it easier to erase indigenous achievement than to confront the uncomfortable truths it revealed. But here is the thing about history. It does not stay buried forever. The mounds are still there. The evidence is still there. And more people are starting to ask the right questions. What else have we forgotten? What other cities? What other cultures? What other stories have been lost or deliberately suppressed? And maybe, just maybe, it is time to start remembering. Cahokia was not alone. That is one of the most important things to understand. It was not some isolated anomaly, some random burst of complexity in an otherwise simple landscape. Cahokia was part of a much larger pattern, a tradition of mound building that stretched across eastern North America for thousands of years. And some of these cultures were even older than Cahokia. Let us start with Poverty Point. Poverty Point is located in northeastern Louisiana, near the Mississippi River, and when archaeologists first studied it, they could not believe what they were seeing. The site dates back to 1700 to 1100 before the Common Era. That is over 3,000 years ago. That is older than the Roman Empire, older than classical Greece, older than most of the civilizations we learn about in school. And yet, the people of Poverty Point built something extraordinary. The site consists of 6 concentric ridges arranged in a massive semicircle. Each ridge is separated by a corridor, creating a pattern that looks almost like an amphitheater when viewed from above. The ridges themselves were built from millions of basket loads of earth, just like at Cahokia. At the center of the complex are several large mounds, including one shaped like a bird in flight. The largest mound, called Mound A, stands 72 feet tall and covers nearly 1 million cubic feet of earth. But here is what makes Poverty Point so remarkable. These people were not farmers. Not really. They were hunter-gatherers. And hunter-gatherer societies are supposed to be small, mobile, egalitarian. They are not supposed to build monumental architecture. They are not supposed to have the population density or social organization to undertake massive construction projects. But Poverty Point proves otherwise. Archaeologists estimate that several thousand people lived at the site, at least seasonally. They hunted, fished, and gathered wild plants. And somehow, they found the time and motivation to move millions of cubic feet of earth to build these ridges and mounds. Why? We do not know. There are no written records. But the sheer scale of the construction suggests that this was a ceremonial center, a place where people gathered for religious or social purposes, a place that held deep significance for the communities that built it. And the evidence shows that Poverty Point was connected to a vast trade network. Archaeologists have found stone tools made from materials that came from as far away as the Great Lakes and the Appalachian Mountains, over 1,000 miles away. These were not primitive people living in isolation. They were part of a sophisticated, interconnected world. Moving forward in time, we come to the Adena culture. The Adena people lived in the Ohio River Valley, roughly from 1000 before the Common Era to 100 of the Common Era. They are best known for their burial mounds, some of which are truly massive. The Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia, for example, stands 69 feet tall and contains 60,000 tons of earth. Inside were elaborate burials with grave goods, copper bracelets, shell beads, carved tablets, evidence of social hierarchy and belief in an afterlife. But the Adena were more than just mound builders. They had an extensive trade network. They created art, carved pipes, and effigies from stone. They developed early forms of horticulture, growing squash, sunflowers, and other crops to supplement their hunting and gathering. And then came the Hopewell culture. The Hopewell people flourished in the Ohio River Valley from around 100 before the Common Era to 500 of the Common Era. They inherited and expanded upon the traditions of the Adena, but they took it to another level entirely. Hopewell earthworks are some of the most geometrically precise structures in the ancient world. They built massive enclosures in perfect circles, squares, and octagons. Some of these earthworks cover hundreds of acres. The Newark earthworks in Ohio, for example, include a circular enclosure 1,200 feet in diameter, connected by earthen walls to a massive octagonal structure. The precision is astounding. These shapes are so exact that they rival the geometry of classical Greek and Roman architecture. And like Cahokia, the Hopewell earthworks were aligned with astronomical events. The octagon at Newark, for instance, is aligned with the maximum northern rising point of the moon, an event that occurs on an 18.6-year cycle. That means the Hopewell were tracking lunar cycles over decades. They were passing that knowledge down through generations. They understood the cosmos in ways that required sophisticated observation and record-keeping. The Hopewell also had one of the most extensive trade networks in ancient North America. Archaeologists have found obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, shells from the Gulf Coast, and even shark teeth from the Atlantic. All of this material ended up in Hopewell burial mounds, placed there as offerings to the dead. This was not casual trade. This was organized, long-distance exchange of valuable goods. It required relationships, trust, and systems of reciprocity that spanned the entire eastern half of the continent. And then, around 500 of the Common Era, the Hopewell culture declined. Not as dramatically as Cahokia, but the great earthworks stopped being built. The trade networks contracted. The population dispersed. We do not know why. Climate change? Social upheaval? Environmental stress? The same questions that haunt Cahokia haunt the Hopewell as well. But the tradition did not die. It evolved. It transformed. And eventually, it gave rise to the Mississippian culture, the culture that built Cahokia. And there is one more site we need to talk about, one that is perhaps the most mysterious of all: Serpent Mound. Serpent Mound is located in southern Ohio, and it is unlike any other earthwork in North America. It is not a platform. It is not a burial mound. It is an effigy, a massive earthen sculpture shaped like a serpent, winding across the landscape for 1,300 feet. The serpent's body curves in 7 distinct coils, and at the head, the jaws are open, holding what appears to be an egg or the sun. Who built it? When? Why? For a long time, archaeologists attributed it to the Adena culture, dating it to around 300 before the Common Era. But more recent research suggests it may have been built much later, possibly by people of the Fort Ancient culture around 1000 of the Common Era, making it roughly contemporary with Cahokia. The alignment of Serpent Mound has been studied extensively. Some researchers believe the head points toward the summer solstice sunset. Others suggest connections to lunar cycles or even specific constellations. But the truth is, we do not really know what it means. It is a mystery, a beautiful, haunting mystery, a reminder that the people who lived here before us saw the world in ways we can barely comprehend. And all of these cultures, Poverty Point, Adena, Hopewell, Mississippian, they were connected, not by a single empire or unified government, but by shared traditions, beliefs, and ways of understanding the cosmos. They built mounds because the act of building was sacred, because elevation brought them closer to the heavens, because the earth itself was a living thing, and shaping it was a form of prayer. And for thousands of years, that tradition persisted until it did not. For a long time, the story we told ourselves about pre-Columbian America was simple. The land was wilderness, vast, untouched forests, endless plains, a few scattered tribes living in harmony with nature, leaving barely a trace of their presence. And then Columbus arrived, and history began. But that story is a lie. Or more accurately, it is a carefully constructed myth that served a very specific purpose. It justified colonization. It made the land seem empty, available, waiting to be claimed. And it erased the reality of what was actually here. The truth is that pre-Columbian America was densely populated, extensively managed, and incredibly diverse. Estimates vary, but most scholars now believe that somewhere between 50 and 100 million people lived in the Americas before European contact. 50 to 100 million. To put that in perspective, Europe at the same time had a population of roughly 70 to 80 million. The Americas were not some empty frontier. They were home to civilizations, nations, and cultures every bit as complex as anything in the Old World, and they had been here for thousands of years. In Mesoamerica, the Maya, the Aztecs, and their predecessors built cities that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. Teotihuacan, at its peak around 500 of the Common Era, had a population of over 100,000 people. It was one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was built on an island in the middle of a lake. It had causeways, aqueducts, floating gardens, and a population of over 200,000. When Spanish conquistadors first saw it in 1519, they compared it to Venice. Some said it was more beautiful, but it was not just Mesoamerica. In South America, the Inca Empire stretched over 2,500 miles along the Andes Mountains, from modern-day Colombia to Chile. They built roads, bridges, and terraced farms on mountainsides. They had a sophisticated system of record-keeping using knotted strings called quipus. They moved massive stones weighing hundreds of tons and fitted them together so precisely that you cannot slide a knife blade between them. And in North America, there was Cahokia and the Hopewell and the ancestral Puebloans in the southwest, who built massive cliff dwellings like Mesa Verde. These were not primitive people. They were engineers, astronomers, artists, and builders. They had governments, religions, economies, and social structures. But here is the thing that changed everything: disease. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they brought with them smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and a host of other diseases that had never existed in the New World. Indigenous Americans had no immunity. None. The result was the largest population collapse in human history. Within a century of contact, roughly 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died. 90%. Entire cities were wiped out. Entire nations vanished. Languages, cultures, knowledge systems, all gone. And the survivors were left in a shattered world. When English colonists arrived in New England in the early 1600s, they found what they described as virgin wilderness. Endless forests with no sign of human presence. They saw this as evidence that God had prepared the land for them, cleared it for their use. But the forests were not empty because no one had ever lived there. They were empty because the people who had lived there were dead, killed by diseases that had swept through years or even decades earlier. Recent research has shown that much of the so-called wilderness that Europeans encountered was actually secondary forest, land that had been cleared and farmed for centuries, but had reverted to forest after the population collapse. Archaeologists have found evidence of extensive agriculture, fire management, and landscape modification throughout the eastern United States. The indigenous peoples of North America were not living lightly on the land. They were actively shaping it, burning forests to create meadows for hunting, cultivating orchards of fruit and nut trees, building fish weirs, and managing waterways. The land that Europeans saw as pristine wilderness was actually a garden that had been abandoned, and the people who survived the epidemics were traumatized, displaced, and overwhelmed. They lost their elders, the keepers of knowledge and tradition. They lost their leaders, their priests, their craftspeople. Entire societies collapsed within a generation. So when European colonists encountered indigenous peoples, they were not seeing them at their height. They were seeing the survivors of an apocalypse. And yet, even in the midst of that catastrophe, indigenous peoples adapted and resisted. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois League, was a sophisticated political alliance of 6 nations in what is now New York State. They had a constitution, a system of checks and balances, and democratic decision-making processes. Some historians believe the Haudenosaunee system influenced the framers of the United States Constitution. The Cherokee developed their own written language in the early 1800s. Within a few years, they had a higher literacy rate than the white settlers around them. They published newspapers, wrote books, and maintained their culture in the face of overwhelming pressure to assimilate. The Plains tribes, after acquiring horses from the Spanish, developed a nomadic lifestyle that allowed them to thrive on the Great Plains. They were not primitive wanderers. They were highly mobile societies with complex social structures, trade networks, and spiritual traditions. But none of this fit the narrative that colonizers needed to believe, so it was ignored, downplayed, erased. History textbooks focused on European achievements and European perspectives. Indigenous peoples were portrayed as obstacles to progress, as relics of a savage past that needed to be swept aside for civilization to flourish. And Cahokia, along with all the other mound-building cultures, was forgotten. But now, slowly, we are beginning to understand what was lost. The Americas before European contact were not empty. They were full of people, full of cultures, full of ideas and innovations that developed independently from the Old World. The people here domesticated different crops: corn, beans, squash, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate. All of these were indigenous to the Americas. They developed different technologies, different ways of organizing society, different philosophies and spiritual traditions. And some of those innovations were, in many ways, ahead of Europe. The Inca had better road systems than the Romans. The Maya had a more accurate calendar than the one used in medieval Europe. Cahokia had urban planning that rivaled anything in the Old World. But because they did not have certain markers of civilization as defined by Europeans, writing in the case of Cahokia, iron tools, horses, they were dismissed as primitive. That dismissal was not just wrong, it was catastrophic. Because, in erasing the achievements of indigenous Americans, we lost knowledge, we lost perspectives, we lost entire ways of understanding the world. and we are still living with the consequences of that loss today. Cahokia is a reminder that the story we have been told about the Americas is incomplete, that there is so much more to learn, so much more to remember. And maybe, just maybe, if we start listening, we can begin to piece together what was lost. So where did they go? That is the question that lingers. When Cahokia was abandoned, when the plazas fell silent and the temples crumbled, where did all those people go? They did not just vanish into thin air. 20 to 40,000 people do not simply disappear. They went somewhere. They became someone. The most likely answer is that they dispersed. As the city declined, as the environmental and social pressures mounted, families and groups began to leave. Some probably moved to smaller settlements along the Mississippi River. Others may have migrated west to the Great Plains or east toward the Appalachians. Over time, they integrated into other communities, other tribes, other ways of life. The knowledge of Cahokia, the memory of what it had been, faded with each passing generation, but some of that memory may have survived. Today, several Native American nations claim cultural and spiritual connections to Cahokia. The Osage Nation, in particular, has oral traditions that speak of their ancestors living in a great city to the east before migrating westward. They describe mounds, ceremonies, and a cosmology that aligns with what archaeologists have found at Cahokia. The Osage are not alone. The Pawnee, the Omaha, the Ponca, and other tribes of the Great Plains and Midwest also have stories and traditions that may link back to Cahokia and the broader Mississippian culture. But here is the problem. Oral traditions are fragile. They change over time. Details are lost or reinterpreted. And when a culture experiences the kind of trauma that indigenous peoples endured after European contact, when 90% of the population dies, when communities are forcibly relocated and children are taken to boarding schools and forbidden to speak their own languages, oral traditions break down, the knowledge holders die, the elders are gone, and the stories fade. So we are left with questions. So many questions. What language did the people of Cahokia speak? We do not know. There are no written records. Linguists can make educated guesses based on the languages spoken by their likely descendants, but we will never hear the actual words that were spoken in that grand plaza 1,000 years ago. What were their names? The rulers, the priests, the artisans, the farmers. They had names. They had identities. They had hopes and fears and dreams, but those names are lost to us now. What did they believe? We know they had elaborate religious rituals. We know they practiced human sacrifice. We know they tracked the movements of the sun and moon with precision, but we do not know the myths they told, the gods they worshipped, the cosmology that gave meaning to their lives. What songs did they sing? What stories did they tell their children? What did they laugh about? What made them weep? All of that is gone. And then there are the practical questions that archaeologists are still trying to answer. Why did they import mica? It served no functional purpose. It was just beautiful. But what did that beauty mean to them? Was it sacred? Was it a symbol of power? Was there a spiritual significance we cannot even begin to understand? How did they organize the labor for building Monk's Mound? Was it voluntary? Was it a form of tribute or taxation? Were people coerced? Did they see it as an honor to contribute their labor to something sacred? What happened during the ceremonies at Woodhenge? We know they aligned the posts with celestial events, but what actually took place on those mornings when the sun rose in perfect alignment? What rituals were performed? What prayers were spoken? And perhaps most tantalizing of all, what lies beneath the unexcavated mounds? Here is something most people do not realize. Only about 1% of Cahokia has been excavated. 1%. The rest remains untouched, buried beneath centuries of soil and grass. There are over 100 mounds at the site. Most of them have never been opened. We do not know what is inside them. There could be burials, artifacts, entire structures preserved under the earth. There could be answers to questions we have not even thought to ask yet. But excavation is slow, expensive, and destructive. Once you dig into a mound, you alter it forever. Modern archaeologists are cautious. They excavate only when necessary, using non-invasive techniques like ground-penetrating radar and magnetic surveys to map what lies beneath before deciding whether to dig. And increasingly, there is a recognition that some things should not be excavated at all, that some mounds are sacred, that they belong to the descendants of the people who built them, and that disturbing them would be a violation. This is a shift in how archaeology is practiced. For a long time, archaeologists treated sites like Cahokia as purely scientific resources, objects to be studied and analyzed. But now, There is a growing understanding that these sites are also cultural heritage, that they have meaning and significance that goes beyond academic research. Native American communities are being included in decisions about how sites like Cahokia are studied, preserved, and interpreted. Their perspectives, their oral traditions, their spiritual connections to these places are being taken seriously in ways they were not before. And that is important, because the people who built Cahokia were not just subjects of study, they were human beings. They were someone's ancestors, and their descendants are still here. But even with this new approach, the questions remain. What could we learn if we had more resources? If we could excavate more carefully, more thoroughly? If we had better technology, better methods? What stories are still buried beneath those mounds, waiting to be told? We may never know the full truth about Cahokia. Too much has been lost. Too much time has passed. But every year, archaeologists discover something new. A pottery shard, a post hole, a trace of pigment on an artifact. Each discovery adds a tiny piece to the puzzle. And slowly, painstakingly, the picture becomes a little clearer. But some mysteries, perhaps, are meant to remain mysteries. Some questions do not have answers, and maybe that is okay. Maybe the unknowing is part of what makes Cahokia so powerful. It reminds us of how much we have lost, how much we will never recover, how fragile human knowledge really is. And maybe, in that reminder, there is a lesson worth remembering. For centuries, Cahokia sat quietly in the Illinois countryside, largely ignored and slowly disappearing. Monk's Mound became farmland. Plows cut into the ancient terraces, eroding them a little more each season. Some of the smaller mounds were leveled entirely, the earth hauled away or flattened to make room for crops and buildings. A highway was built straight through part of the site. Houses, gas stations, parking lots, all encroached on what had once been sacred ground. By the mid-20th century, much of Cahokia had been damaged or destroyed, and most people still had no idea what it was. But a few archaeologists understood. In the 1960s and 70s, as we mentioned earlier, researchers like Melvin Fowler began serious, systematic excavations at Cahokia. They mapped the site, they documented the mounds, they analyzed artifacts and began to piece together the story of what this place had been. And as that story emerged, people started to pay attention. In 1964, the state of Illinois designated Cahokia Mounds as a state historic site. It was a small step, but an important one. It meant the site would be protected, preserved, and maintained for future generations. In 1966, it was designated a National Historic Landmark, and in 1982, it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as a place of outstanding universal value to all of humanity. That designation put Cahokia on the global stage. It placed it in the same category as the Great Wall of China, the Taj Mahal, and the Pyramids of Giza. It was an acknowledgement, finally, that what happened here mattered, that this was not just a regional curiosity or a footnote in American history. This was a significant chapter in the human story. But recognition alone does not preserve a site. It takes work. Ongoing, painstaking work. Today, the Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site covers about 2,200 acres, though the original city was much larger. Many of the mounds outside the protected area have been lost to development, but what remains is being carefully preserved. Park rangers and archaeologists maintain the site, monitoring erosion, controlling vegetation, and conducting research. Wooden stairs have been built on Monk's Mound so visitors can climb to the top without damaging the ancient terraces. Interpretive signs and a visitor center help educate the public about what Cahokia was and why it matters. And increasingly, Native American voices are part of that conversation. The Osage Nation, along with other tribes, has worked with site managers to ensure that Cahokia is presented respectfully, accurately, and in a way that honors the people who built it. Tribal elders have shared oral traditions. Native artists have contributed to exhibits, and there is an ongoing dialogue about how to interpret the site in ways that reflect indigenous perspectives, not just the perspectives of non-indigenous archaeologists. This is a significant shift. For too long, Native Americans were excluded from the narrative of their own history. Their voices were silenced, their knowledge dismissed. But now, slowly, that is changing. And it is changing in other ways too. Modern technology is giving us new tools to study Cahokia without disturbing it. Ground-penetrating radar can reveal what lies beneath the surface without a single shovel breaking the soil. LiDAR, a laser-based mapping technology, can detect subtle features in the landscape that are invisible to the naked eye, revealing the outlines of ancient structures, pathways, and earthworks. Using these tools, researchers have discovered features at Cahokia that were previously unknown: hidden mounds, buried post circles, the foundations of structures that have long since vanished. Each discovery adds to our understanding of how the city was organized and how its people lived. There is also a growing interest in experimental archaeology. Researchers are attempting to recreate the techniques that the Cahokians used. How did they move 22 million cubic feet of earth? What tools did they use? How long would it have taken? Some archaeologists have built scale models of the mounds using the same basket and labor methods. Others have experimented with firing pottery using traditional techniques or working copper with stone hammers. These experiments help us understand not just what the Cahokians built, but how they built it. And then there are the digital reconstructions. Using data from excavations, surveys, and research, artists and historians have created computer-generated images and animations showing what Cahokia might have looked like at its peak. These reconstructions are not just guesswork, they are based on evidence. The placement of buildings, the layout of plazas, the height and shape of the mounds. When you see these reconstructions, the scale of Cahokia becomes real in a way that standing in an empty field cannot convey. You see the wooden temples rising from the tops of the mounds, the thatched roof houses spreading out in every direction, the crowds gathering in the Grand Plaza, the palisade wall encircling the sacred center. You see a city, a living, breathing city, and that changes how we think about it. Education is also playing a role in Cahokia's rediscovery. More and more schools are including Cahokia in their curricula. Teachers are using it as an example of indigenous achievement, a counter-narrative to the outdated idea that Native Americans were primitive. Museums across the country are creating exhibits about Cahokia and the broader mound-building tradition. Books, documentaries, and podcasts are bringing the story to wider audiences, and visitors are coming. Slowly, the word is spreading. People are starting to realize that there is something extraordinary in southern Illinois, something that rivals the great ancient sites anywhere in the world. But there is still so much work to do. Cahokia deserves more funding, more research, more recognition. It deserves to be as famous as Machu Picchu or Chichen Itza. It deserves to be part of the conversation when we talk about human achievement and the great civilizations of the past. Because Cahokia is not just an American story. It is a human story. A story of what people can accomplish when they work together, when they dream big, when they look up at the stars and imagine something greater than themselves. And it is a reminder that history is not just written by the victors. It is written by those who remember, by those who care enough to dig, to preserve, to tell the story again and again until it can no longer be forgotten. Cahokia was forgotten once, but it will not be forgotten again. So here we are, at the end of this long journey through time. We have walked through the ruins of a city that should not have existed. We have stood at the base of Monk's Mound and imagined the thousands of baskets of earth carried to build it. We have watched the sun rise over Woodhenge, aligned perfectly with posts placed there 1,000 years ago. We have explored the trade networks that stretched across a continent, the engineering marvels that rival anything built in the ancient world, and the mysteries that still remain buried beneath the soil. And through it all, one question has lingered. Why does this matter? Why should we care about a city that collapsed 700 years ago? Why should we remember people whose names we will never know, whose language we will never speak, whose songs we will never hear? Because Cahokia challenges us. It challenges the stories we have been told about who we are and where we came from. It challenges the narrative that civilization came to this continent with European ships. It challenges the idea that progress moves in only one direction, that societies only rise and never fall, that the past was simpler and less sophisticated than the present. Cahokia reminds us that human beings have always been capable of extraordinary things, that ingenuity, creativity, and ambition are not unique to any one culture or time period, that people have been building, dreaming, and reaching for the stars for as long as we have existed. But it also reminds us of fragility. Cahokia fell, not because its people were primitive or inferior, but because they faced challenges they could not overcome. Environmental collapse, climate change, social upheaval, the same kinds of challenges we face today. And their knowledge, their achievements, their stories, almost disappeared entirely. If not for a few archaeologists who refused to stop digging, if not for the descendants who kept their oral traditions alive, if not for the mounds themselves, standing silent witness to what once was, Cahokia might have been lost forever. That should terrify us. and inspire us. Because if a civilization this advanced can be forgotten, what else have we lost? What other voices have been silenced? What other achievements have been erased? And what are we doing today to ensure that our own stories, our own knowledge, will survive? Cahokia deserves to be remembered, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a testament to human resilience, creativity, and the enduring desire to build something greater than ourselves. As you drift off tonight, imagine yourself standing in that grand plaza. The sun is setting behind Monk's Mound, casting long shadows across the earth. Thousands of people surround you, their voices rising in song or prayer. The smell of wood smoke drifts through the air, drums echo in the distance. You are part of something ancient, something powerful, something that transcends time. And in that moment, Cahokia is not forgotten. It lives, in your imagination, in your memory, in the stories we tell. If this journey has fascinated you, if it has changed the way you see history, consider subscribing to Mr. H. There are so many more forgotten stories waiting to be told, so many mysteries still buried beneath the earth, and maybe, together, we can make sure they are never forgotten again. Sleep well, and remember Cahokia, the civilization that should not have existed, but did.